not only a sitting MP, MP for Islington North, and has a parliamentary career that stretches over 30 years. He's also chairman of the national chair of the National Stop the War Coalition, patron of the Palestine Solidarity campaign. He strongly opposed the Iraq War and participated in international anti-war demonstrations, and he was recently at the heart of the landmark parliamentary vote against UK participation in a military strike on Syria, as was noted earlier this evening. And as Jeremy has been quoted as saying, and I'm sure he has said it, quote, "You do not bomb people to bring about peace." And in that context, let us also note that Jeremy is the National Vice Chair of CND. Please join me in welcoming the Chair of the National Stop the War Coalition, Jeremy Corbyn.
You don't mind if I stand, I just feel more comfortable that way. Is that all right? Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. First of all, big thank you for inviting us along here this evening. This has got to be the best organised and most efficient local stop the war group in the world, actually. So, a really big thank you to yourself, Chair, and Sheila, and all the other colleagues that have put so much together to ensure that this meeting happens tonight. And what an amazing venue. I couldn't believe it walking up the path there. They all strode on without even looking. I stopped to take a picture. It's got something homely and attractive about the light coming out of this lovely old building, and we're coming here together to discuss something with a sense of common purpose about it. It's bringing us together. Is that okay? And also lovely to see Galinda here. Hello. Old friend from North Islington, great community activist. I hope you're shaking things up around here as well. I'm sure you are. So there's an awful lot I could say, and I'll try and keep it within reasonable time, otherwise I'll upset my good friend, the chair on my right here. First thing I want to say is that I am National Chair of the Stop the War Coalition. It wasn't a position I ever wanted or sought. I was heavily lent on to take it on, which I'm very happy to do. It's just I have a few other things to do as well. And because I believe very strongly in the importance of having a coalition of peace organisations that can mobilise public opinion and can give everyone a space in which they can discuss a different approach to the way the world looks at things. And so we are therefore pretty unprescriptive as an organisation. We couldn't be anything but unprescriptive because of the nature of a coalition of peace organisations. But that doesn't mean we're ineffective. We were founded in 2001, not over Iraq, but over Afghanistan. And I've never forgotten that founding meeting when John Rees and others phoned me up and said, we're putting this idea together to Stop the War Coalition. What do you think about that? I said, oh, it sounds like a good idea, let's do that. And then he said they were going to hold it at Conway Hall in Red Lion Square. I said, fine, we agreed the date. And then he phoned up a week later and said, do you think are you okay if we go into the large hall there? I said, ooh, sounds a bit risky to me. I don't like small meetings in big halls. I'd rather have big meetings in small halls. And then a few days later, he said, we're going to a friend's house. I said, hang on a minute, this is getting a bit out of hand here. And then eventually we did move it to the friend's house. I had an advice bureau in my constituency, and as soon as that was through, I cycled down there, rushed down there. And the place was absolutely heaving. There was like 3,000 people in the building. Every single room had been taken over for an overflow meeting, and a further overflow meeting was held outside of the bus stop on the Euston Road. And so all of us had to deliver our speeches 6 times throughout the evening. So they got better as they went on. And my best speech was the one at the bus stop at the end of it. But I just felt then, there's something in this, because all the newspapers and all the parliamentary opinion was that the answer to 9/11 is to bomb Afghanistan. Hello? Hang on. Take me through that again. 9/11 was a disaster, obviously. Contemptible, wrong, disaster. So you bomb Afghanistan. And then, of course, once you've done that, what do you do next? You then try and control Afghanistan. You then try and deal with what you believe to be the problem, and so you introduce Bagram Air Base, you introduce Guantanamo Bay, you introduce extraordinary rendition, you introduce the concept of something above and way beyond the law of pursuit of people that you believe to be enemy combatants, something that doesn't exist in international law at all. So you think of all the liberties internationally and international law that's been damaged by the original attack on Afghanistan, then George Bush's absurd axis of evil speech in January 2002, and our own problems where we've passed successions of anti-terror laws through the British Parliament which allow politicians to detain, hold, imprison people under immigration law or any other piece of convenience. We also have house arrest in this country, and we also have the concept of secret courts, which has been built on that. And I have to say, I've made myself incredibly unpopular with a lot of people in Parliament. I voted against every single one of those. Not because I'm in favour of terrorism or bombs on the streets of London. 12 of my constituents were killed on 7/7. Does that mean that we have a greater attack on our civil liberties because it protects us? No, it doesn't. If someone commits a criminal act, use the criminal law against them. Don't set up some kind of secret court scenario which is largely designed to protect the security services from giving any evidence of what they've actually been doing. Hence the latest secret courts thing that went through, because of the amount of compensation they've had to pay out to one Libyan person because he was extraordinarily rendited to Gaddafi, because at that time Tony Blair was playing footsie with Gaddafi, and the whole thing sort of unravels. And so in a democracy, you defend democracy and you defend your civil liberties and you defend the independence of your legal system. One of my people that I really admire most was the former Prime Minister of Norway, Stoltenberg, when after that Breivik attack in Oslo, what was his response? We will fight this thing with humanity and democracy. Big difference from George Bush saying we'll go to war with the whole world because of something without ever beginning to think about why that particular thing had come about. We then moved on to the question of Iraq, and George Bush named Iraq as a point of axis of evil and said that somehow or other Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were kind of in it all together, and they were part of the same kind of nasty group of nasty people that are trying to do nasty things to the whole world. Well, the only thing I could think of that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden had in common, and it took me a long time to think about this, was they both tried to kill each other at various times in their lives. They had nothing in common whatsoever. They were totally different people in every way, except perhaps brutal in the way they did things. And so we were then told that the important thing was to go to war with Iraq because of the supposed presence of weapons of mass destruction. And now, I am no apologist for Saddam Hussein. Indeed, I recall a very lonely period in the 1980s after the Halabja gas attack. I have a lot of Kurdish people living in my constituency, and there's still are, there's probably more now, living in my constituency. And I felt very keenly about that Halabja attack. I raised the question many times in Parliament, and the use of chemical weapons and Britain's trade with Iraq and arms supplies to Iraq and all the rest of it. You know what I was told? Be a bit careful on this one. There's a very important market for us in Iraq for weapons. This was 1988. Halabja happened, and we had many meetings with Foreign Office ministers, and Bruce Kent and I went to every embassy of Security Council members to raise the issue about chemical weapons and so on. And Britain took part in the Baghdad Arms Fair in 1989, just a year after Halabja. And that was only a year before the start of the Gulf War. And so when you start into the arms trade and all the commercial interests that go there, human rights, humanity, legal systems go out of the window because the other factor takes over. And I think we need to think about that in terms of our own national narrative and what happens in the longer term about our own foreign and defence policies. Now, the vote in Parliament on Syria a few weeks ago It didn't all happen overnight, obviously. And during that debate, and at the end of it, I wasn't confident we were going to win the vote until it actually happened, actually. I was doing sums on the backs of bits of paper all day, so, you know, is he going to be here, is she going to be here, will they be late, will the train be cancelled, you know, all that kind of thing, because it all comes down to those kind of calculations as well as the larger picture of the debate. And eventually, you know the result as well as I do. I thought, in a way, that result was the result of every march, every meeting, every rally, every protest, every petition, every street stall, every leaflet session all of us have ever done over the past 15 years, because it was the result of a gradual gnawing away at those that try to form public opinion. They're saying there is a different way of doing things. You don't have to resort to sending troops and weapons into every situation. You have to look towards some kind of process that's going to bring about peace. And people have maybe learned the lesson of watching the coffins come home from Afghanistan, watching the coffins come home from Iraq, the £30 billion that have been spent, and all the damage to our own civil liberties and everything else that's happened as a result of it. And I have met many soldiers' families and returning soldiers during this period. And there are people that probably politically wouldn't agree with me on very much, but they said, hang on, you lot that stood up against the war, you were saying it like it was. You were saying that what a disaster and a danger this thing is. But the Syria vote was also preceded, if you remember, by earlier this year there was starting to be big pressure of sending arms to the opposition. And a number of us in all parties, Labour, Liberal Democrat, Conservative, National, and so on, raised objections to the sending of arms for a number of reasons. One is, what arms are you going to send? Who are you going to send them to? What's going to happen to them when they get there? And what's going to be the effect in the war? And these objections were quite strong by a group of us from both parties, or all parties. And we continually raised them. And then there was a question that the government might send them in August, because that's when the EU arms embargo expired, and not consult Parliament in so doing. And so we raised objections with the Speaker and tried to amend parliamentary standing orders so that Parliament could be recalled by a group of MPs rather than the Speaker on the request from the Prime Minister. A very big difference if that ever comes about. It may well. And we then managed to force a backbench debate for one day on the subject, which we put a motion down saying that there should be no arms supplied without a specific parliamentary vote and endorsement before any arms will be supplied. We put it in those terms to get the largest number of support. And we came to the decision itself, and there was hardly anyone prepared to oppose our motion, but we were still very keen to get it on the record as a voted motion of the British Parliament saying exactly that. So I had this very embarrassing situation. We came to the vote, we couldn't find it, as you're probably aware, in Parliament you have to have two MPs from each side of the argument to be tellers to count the votes of the rest of the colleagues who were voting. We couldn't find any people to vote and oppose our own motion. So I had to be a teller for the noes against the motion I had indeed proposed, which is a slightly odd thing. So if any of you ever become students of British political history in future years, please forgive me. For Father I have sinned, but it was in a good cause. And we duly won the vote with only one MP voting that we should supply arms to Syria, the Syrian opposition straight away. And during that debate there were some quite funny moments. Somebody put the obvious question. You're going to send these arms. Which group? Who's going to get them? Where are they going to be used? And how are you going to make sure they're delivered to the appropriate, responsible group of opponents rather than the irresponsible group of opponents? So somebody, another MP intervened and said, I've got a really good idea. I said, what's that? We could send the army to deliver them and they could monitor the use of them. You then realise you're reaching the levels of absurdity in this particular debate. And so the House was then recalled, and David Cameron proposed a motion that we did, which was essentially that we should join with the US in selective bombardment of the targets of the chemical weapons usage. Very unclear about what you're going to do after that. Who do you bomb? What do you destroy? What do you take out? And also, something tells me that if a place is full of canisters of sarin gas, it's not a very clever idea to bomb it. Because Quite simply, where's the gas going to go? If you want to think about that, the bombing of southern Iraq during the Gulf War did lead to an awful lot of horrible residues, which are still causing cancers and destruction for the people in southern Iraq, all these years after the Gulf War, 20 years after the Gulf War. And the debate went on, and the parliamentary vote was what it was. Now, sometimes in the midst of a historical change, it's not so obvious that you are. I think there's something highly significant about this. The British Parliament said no to a government request to go into a war situation, and instead said, find another way of doing it. I'm not here to defend President Assad. I'm not here to defend the use of chemical weapons under any circumstances. I condemn it in Syria. I condemned it in Iraq. I condemned it in Fallujah. I condemn the use of depleted uranium. I condemn the use of white phosphorus against the Palestinian people. It's all equally bad and equally wrong. We've got to, and if we're serious about it, then we'd ban depleted uranium, we'd ban white phosphorus, and we would ban those weapons that do that sort of thing. So let's put that there. And in doing that, I'm not saying it had the massive effect in the USA, but it did have an effect. And so the US Congress, the House rather, more than the Senate, was giving Obama a lot of trouble. So he didn't push the motion, didn't recall the Congress early as he was trying to do. And instead, they were forced to have a meeting with the Russian foreign minister and move towards, A, the removal of all chemical weapons and put them under international control. And obviously that leads on then to having some completely different process in the region. Now, maybe our campaigning and our vote was a part of that process that brought about the fact that Russians and Americans were forced to meet in Geneva, and the Geneva II conference may well take place. I hope it does. But unless you resolve a war, as you were saying, Dan, by a political process, then you've achieved nothing. And that means there has to be a conference. But there has to be a conference that brings in all the players. Now, the obvious players, clearly, Syrian government, clearly Syrian opposition groups, be they, quotes, jihadists, unquotes, be they some other form of group, Iran as an important neighbour, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are pouring vast amounts of money and weapons into some of the opposition groups, and the US obviously, and the European Union, and so on. And so there has to be those talks. 100,000 people have already died in this terrible war. 2 million people are refugees. And there's something about refugees in the Middle East that I find quite terrifying, actually. I went to Syria 4 years ago, I think it was. And I went there because there was a very large group of Palestinian refugees stuck on no man's land between Iraq and Syria. Literally in the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles from anywhere. It took 6 hours to drive there from Damascus to get to this spot, just through complete desert. It was winter time, so it was very wet, very unpleasant. Sandstorm was very cold as well. And this group of about 1,000 Palestinian refugees had been driven out of Iraq because the new forces in Iraq had decided that these poor people were somehow the allies of Saddam Hussein. They weren't. They were Palestinians who wanted to live. And they were living in these horrible tents, which many had been burnt down because they were using gas fires to try and heat them, and that set fire to the tent. They couldn't get out in time, so they were burnt to death in the tents. It was a horrible situation. And they weren't being allowed into Syria, and they weren't being allowed back into Iraq. And so the UN were providing food and water, but that was about it. And so a group of us, a small delegation of us, went there to Syria. And then I sat in these tents talking to these Palestinians, and they told me their family story. Came from Haifa, went to Gaza, went to one of the Gulf states, ended up in Iraq, now would go to Syria. Then, if they could, they'd go to Europe or Canada or somewhere else, endlessly wandering the globe, trying to go home. And that's surely the story of the Palestinian people. And so, in all these discussions, let's not forget the way in which the Palestinian people have been treated, their wish for their recognition, their justice and their peace, which comes as part of this whole process. Anyway, there was a good ending in a limited way to that particular story, and that The Syrian government did allow them in. We did manage to extract some more money from the UN to pay for them, and they were given places to go. And so, at a temporary, immediate level, it was, I suppose, a relatively good story. But that is the problem of the whole region. Massive numbers of refugees who live in Lebanon, live in Jordan, live in Egypt, and all the other countries. Now then, where does this go to next? The question of nuclear weapons and Iran in the region are very, very important. I attended the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. I've been to a lot of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review conferences. The most important one said a declaration wanting a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. Good. How do you achieve that? You achieve that by using the power of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to bring the nuclear powers together. The problem is the NPT has 5 declared weapon states: France, Russia, China, Britain and the USA. And there are a number of other states around the world that either have nuclear weapons or are trying to develop them, such as India, Pakistan and North Korea, and Israel, which definitely has nuclear weapons, and Iran, which, depending on who you believe, is trying to develop them or is not trying to develop them. And the NPT decided they would set up a nuclear weapons-free Middle East conference that would include both Israel and Iran. It was usually to be held in Helsinki, and it was never held, and it still hasn't been held. And because it's never been held, Egypt has then dropped out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as have a number of other countries. The situation is very dangerous. Unless there is real movement to bring about a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, then Egypt could develop nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia could develop nuclear weapons. Anyone that's got nuclear power would not find it difficult to develop nuclear weapons. And with the level of armaments available in Saudi Arabia and other countries that have a delivery system to go with it as well. And so, whilst I do not think that Iran should have nuclear weapons, I don't think Israel should have nuclear weapons either. And there has to be a process that brings about peace and disarmament. Now, the election of President Rouhani in Iran is a very interesting step forward. And his statements at the UN were very interesting as well. And his whole approach to the whole issue is extremely interesting. The speech he made, I watched it last night on the television at the UN, was, I think, a quite remarkable speech. I don't agree with everything he said. I don't agree with the human rights record in Iran. But I do have some sense of the history, as Sammy was talking about, of our participation in Iran, our theft of Iranian oil, our promotion of the coup in Iran in 1952. People in Iran remember these things. It's in their psyche, it's in their memory. Just as we remember, not personally, but we remember the Second World War, we remember all the issues surrounding the way in which this country's participation in history has been. And so, we've got to think about our role in Britain and what we do in the future. I think we've turned a corner by saying we're not sending weapons or war or soldiers or air force or navy into Syria. Instead, we're going to be trying to be part of a political peace process. I hope it stays like that. But there's a big decision coming up in Parliament in 2 years' time, 2.5 years' time. 2016, Parliament has to make the main gate decision on the replacement of the Trident nuclear missile system and the submarines that go with it. That system will cost £100 billion. For 25 years, £100 billion. So the defence budget will be around sort of 3 to 5 billion pounds per year will be taken out of the budget to pay for these weapons of mass destruction, our very own weapons of mass destruction. Just imagine if Parliament was bold enough to say, no, we're not doing that. Instead, we're going to invest in high-tech industries. We're going to invest in green jobs. We're going to invest in sustainability. We're going to invest in better railways. We're going to invest in better ships. We're going to invest in civilian aircraft. We're going to instead move ourselves into an economy for peace rather than this over-reliance on defence industry jobs and the defence budget that goes with it. It's actually more sustainable, more secure, and does more good to the rest of the world than doing this. And I just hope that this turning point is the beginning of that. But the points that Dan and Sammy were making, I think, are very, very important. Why have we been involved in all these wars over the past years, ever since the end of the Cold War? Partly it's pressure because military establishments are quite keen on looking for things to do after the end of the Cold War. I lost count of the number of breakfasts, seminars and conferences I was invited to at the end of the Cold War, which said we need to discuss the role of the armed forces in a post-Cold War period. And you'd go to these meetings and all these people scratching their heads. Where's the enemy now? Who is the enemy? Who do we attack now? Come on. We've got all these weapons, they've got to be pointed at somebody, and then you kind of make light-hearted remarks like that. I'm really suspicious of Iceland. Why? What have they got? Is it fish? What's in it? You know, it's all that sort of thing. And then, of course, at the back of it is also the question of the world's thirst and greed for minerals and the control of them. And so the death rates in all these conflicts are not totally to do with minerals, not totally to do with oil, but it is a very important factor. More people have actually been killed in the Congo than in wars anywhere else, and that is entirely fueled by mining companies illegally taking minerals and so on out of the Congo and funding militias to protect their operations. It's a vicious, horrible war. I've been in eastern Congo and I've been in the refugee camps there, and I have a very large Congolese community in my constituency, and I talk to them about it. And so war always has something behind it. Those that make money out of war, those that lose their civil liberties out of war, those that lose their lives out of war, those that are impoverished by war, those that are devastated by war, those that become refugees because of war. Surely to God, in the 21st century, we can do things a bit better and a bit different. So when we marched against the Afghanistan war in 2001, when 2 million of us took to the streets on that great day, February the 15th, 2003, and showed our opposition to it, and the way that 600 cities around the world had demonstrations against that war. I mean, I had the pleasure, it was a pleasure actually, of speaking at the London demonstration and then getting an overnight flight to New York and then getting another flight from there to San Francisco and then going to speak at a San Francisco rally the following afternoon. I was a bit tired and I couldn't quite remember where I was, but the speech was okay, I think. And we had there Bonnie Ray and a number of other people speaking, Joan Baez and others, incredible feeling. You just suddenly felt, hang on, there are people all around the world who are serious that they're not going to go to war. Okay, we didn't stop that war. I do think we stopped an immediate attack on Iran. I do think we've stopped our participation in the Syrian war. I do think we've changed the public psyche and the national psyche and the thinking in this country that we have to recognise what we are. A small island of 65 million people on the northwest coast of Europe. Do we need weapons to reach the whole world? No. Do we need nuclear weapons? No. Do we need to make a contribution to world poverty, to the sanitation crisis, to all the crises that exist around the world, the real causes of war? Yes, we do, and yes, we must, as we must invest in our own health services, education, and everything else. And so I just feel that all that we've done has made an enormous contribution. This is not a time for self-satisfaction, sitting back and patting ourselves on the back. Now is a time to go out there, campaign for peace, campaign against the replacement of the Trident nuclear missile system, and campaign for a foreign policy based on peace, respect, disarmament and human rights, not on invasion, control and theft and greed and taking. That surely will make us a stronger country and a stronger people as a result of that. And I thank you very much for supporting Scotland.